Okay. So, good evening and welcome everyone to Real Talk About Real Marriage, a special book launch event with Sarah Griffith Lund and friends. I'm Deborah Arca with Chalice Press, and I am so delighted to welcome you to this very special event tonight. Blessed Union, Breaking the Silence About Mental Illness and Marriage, launches today. And this here tonight is how the Reverend Dr. Lund wanted to celebrate. She wanted to sit around a virtual table with good friends and get real about marriage. So you are in for some goodness tonight. Let me quickly introduce you to Sarah and her friends. Sarah Griffith Lund, you'll find her there in the Rev hat, serves as the Minister for Disabilities and Mental Health Justice on the national staff of the United Church of Christ, and is Senior Pastor of First Congregational UCC in Indianapolis, Indiana. She's the author of Blessed Union, as well as Blessed Are the Crazy, Breaking the Silence About Mental Illness, Family, and Church. Monica Coleman, Monica, you want to wave, is an award-winning scholar, writer, and minister, and the author of Bipolar Faith, A Black Woman's Journey with Depression and Faith. Next, we have Karl Shallowhorn, who's in the middle there. He runs a consulting business and is the author of several books, including Working on Wellness, A Practical Guide to Mental Health. David Finnegan-Hosey is a college chaplain. You'll find him over there with the fun sweatshirt. I can't quite read what that says, but I'm thinking it looks pretty fun. Mental health is political. Okay. He's a college chaplain and pastor and author of Christ on the Psych Ward and Grace is a Pre-Existing Condition. Christina Davis, below there, is a professor of pastoral theology and marriage and family therapy. Okay, professor of pastoral theology and marriage and family therapy at Christian Theological Seminary in Indianapolis, right?
Indianapolis, that's right.
Thank you. And last but not least is our fellow Chalice author, Rachael Keefe, who is also a UCC pastor and the author of The Life-Saving Church, Faith Communities, and Suicide Prevention. So thank you all for being here tonight. We are so honored. And Sarah, your table is ready.
Oh, thank you. Big, big love to all of you for joining me at this table and for all who will be listening in to our conversation. Tonight, it's all about real talk about real marriage. So I wanted to begin by asking my friends, why does this conversation matter to you? When you heard from me and I invited you to join me for real talk about real marriage, why did you say yes? I know you all aren't shy. Jump in.
My first thought was that mental illness is part of all marriage, because mental health it's on a continuum and no one is 100% healthy. No one. So our mental health is a significant part of our marriages. That was my first thought.
Yeah, and I'd follow up and say, certainly I agree with that. And of course, speaking for myself, I also kind of personalized the introduction. And I know for myself, living with bipolar disorder, my wife, we've been married for 26 years and known each other for 28. And it was one of the first things that was early on in our relationship, one of the discussion points. And I just know how important it's been to talk about it and grow with each other. And I know it's been a big part of our relationship.
Like, certainly for me and my wife Lee, who is the other Reverend Finnegan-Hosey, this is a personal part of our relationship. I have bipolar disorder. Also grew up in a household that was really impacted by mental health challenges and the impacts of that on relationships. So there's a personal level for me, and there's also, I think, a level where I think a lot of the work that we do in normalizing conversations about mental illness and mental health challenges is also just work about normalizing hard conversations within relationships, within faith communities, right? There's, the specific topic matter we might be talking about might be mental illness, right? But just in a more general sense, the ability to bring our perspectives of faith, of justice, of love to difficult topic matter and hold space for that difficult topic matter, I think is kind of the work we're about.
Well, one of the main reasons I said yes is because I really love joining Sarah in any kind of advocacy work and lifting awareness work. It's been my joy to be able to serve alongside her when I first moved to Indianapolis about 7 years ago. And so it excites me, the work that she's doing to really break stigmas. And I certainly see that, particularly now, but I think there's certainly an evergreen nature to what it means to break the stigma of mental health and mental illness conversations in relationships. I hear a lot more about how we talk about individuals dealing with mental health and mental illness, but what does that mean for couples and what does that mean for relationships and marriages? And I think that that's a conversation that we could be talking about a lot more, especially during this time of pandemic and being at home more. And so how those things impact relationships certainly, I think, can be magnified at such a time as this. So a very important conversation.
Well, when I told her, Sarah knows this, when she first asked, I was like, I don't know, because I always feel so uncomfortable talking about things I'm still in the middle of. Like, I want to talk about things that I've figured out and that I've done well. And then I can sound like smart and erudite about them. And I was like, this one is kind of kicking my butt right now. So I think I should just listen to you talk. And I think that kind of discomfort is exactly why I wanted to be at the table. Because, I'm thinking of the marriage counseling I've had with clergy and with therapists, and no one talked about mental health, even though I'm very publicly a mental health advocate and live with mental health challenges. And I'm like, we got nothing. We have no tools for these things. We're all just hacking it out. And I really am excited about your work so that we don't all have to hack it out and figure this out and build as if we're the first ones doing it.
Oh, thank you so much. I mean, when I think about living myself in recovery with post-traumatic stress disorder, and my partner is in recovery from depression and anxiety and addictions, when I think about our marriage, this is a choice. I make every day to stay in this marriage. And for me, what's different about it, as I wrote in my first book about my family system and, a parent or a sibling, you don't choose, who your siblings are, your parents are. Those are relationships you're born into. And so for me, it's so different, when you choose to stay in relationship throughout all the ups and downs of mental health challenges. And to your point, Monica, I mean, it's not something we've really talked a lot about. Even among my closest friends, I don't talk to them about this. And I think part of it, to your point, Christina, is because of stigma, right? Yeah. And so I'd love to hear what you all think about what impact stigma is having and how it is felt, in our blessed unions. Mm.
I think that the main casualty of stigma is the ability to be authentic and honest about oneself and one's experience and one's feelings. It silences under that cloak of shame when there's something that says that what you're experiencing makes you in some way not good enough or not doing enough or just not enough in one way or the other. And then even worse, of course, or maybe just as bad, I think sometimes there's this legacy of faith communities that have somehow linked kind of being, there being some moral failing, not praying enough or not being righteous enough if and when one struggles with mental illness, but really many illnesses, right? So there's these, I agree with David's comments, that some in many ways it's conversations about those difficult topics of many kinds, and mental illness in marriages is one really important example of that. And I think certainly ministers, pastors, and even in my role, often as a counselor, it's the work of really helpfully and gently, but sometimes directly, holding up some of those beliefs and challenging them and looking at them again, and seeing whether or not those the beliefs that the stigma is based on are really true and are really serving us.
I'd love to also hear what you all define stigma as, right? I mean, so what is stigma and how does it show up in this conversation?
Well, I see stigma as being basically a sign of shame or just embarrassment or fear of being open, for fear of this being labeled. And I know that's something that many, if not most people who live with mental conditions at some point in their lives at least have dealt with. I know I certainly had for a long time. And when I think about my relationship, I know certainly early on, I didn't want to say anything to my spouse. So of course, when we first met, it took a lot of courage to say those words. I have bipolar disorder. And I'll be honest, and I've said this before, it was almost a deal breaker. It was almost the kind of thing where I think she just said, I don't have anything to do with this. But fortunately, she had a friend that said, I think Karl's cool, so why don't you stick with him? So it worked.
I think, stigma is what keeps us silent, or the fear of stigma, that shame that's handed to us from somebody else. And with marriage, I know for myself, I spent so long trying to prove to the church and to everyone else that I was fully recovered that I didn't want to acknowledge I still had symptoms of PTSD, or that I still occasionally struggled with depression. So I internalized that stigma. And I still have some anxiety about saying that out loud, even though I've written a book about it. So when it comes to sharing, like, my wife is also very open about her mental health struggles, but when it comes to sharing specifically how our own stuff gets in the way of our marriage sometimes, it's like we're not supposed to have problems. So we're both clergy, we're both, we're full-grown adults. You're just not supposed to struggle. So that sort of imposed stigma from society, from church particularly, is often what contributes to the discomfort, for me at least.
So I'll say two quick things. One is that stigma, I think, in addition to all of the wonderful insights that have been shared already, is an othering, right? Like stigma others something about me. Right, like just sharing the sentiment a couple of other people mentioned, right? Like I've written books about this and shared my story, and it's still hard for me to call my boss and say, hey, I need a mental health day, right? Just to a basic example, which I think leads to the second thing I'll say, which is stigma is also about material conditions, right? So I'm wearing my mental health is political dinosaur sweatshirt, which I've realized also has my 3-month-old drool on it. So how's that for real talk about real marriage? But, right. So it's really a lot easier for me to talk openly and honestly about bipolar disorder in a relationship if I know that I can seek treatment without going $100,000 into medical debt, right? So there's a mutual reinforcing circle between the sort of belief system of stigma and the material conditions that mean that we don't fund mental health research, that we don't provide coverage for mental parity and coverage for mental health treatment, et cetera, et cetera. We could, have a whole long conversation about that, right? But, I think there's that both that othering of the belief, right, about mental illness also makes conversations about how we care for people with mental health challenges, conversations that are held at arm's length, rather about being a group of people saying like, hey, this impacts me. Like, this is really important for me to have this access to this kind of care.
I think for me, the stigma aspect is more around marriage than around the mental health part, in the sense that I still think, even though people will say we've been married 25, 30 years and there've been low days and there've been good days, but no one's talking about the bad days when they're in the bad days. And so, I started asking couples like, how, my God, how do you stay married? They're like, oh man, I left for like 5 months in year 7. I'm like, oh, so I think a lot of it, to me, the stigma is about how hard marriage is and how hard it is to stay married, and that choosing everyday part, and not being able to always name why it's so hard. Is it the mental health? Is it the this? Is it the that? Is it the this? Right? And not loving that that's part of what it could possibly be, when of course it's probably this wonderful stew of tons of things, right? But just how difficult commitment partnerships are when you start throwing life in the mix, and not having enough conversations about that, particularly in religious communities that like to lift up certain forms of family.
Yeah, I think there's that. And then there's the flip side of that sometimes divorce is the healthiest choice. And we don't want to admit that, particularly in the church. Even progressive church has this thing about divorce, and particularly in its clergy. So, yes, marriage is hard, and you have to make the choice sometimes every day to stay in it. And yes, sometimes divorce is the right thing and the healthy thing for one or both partners, and that contributes to the stigma and silence as well.
It's like a double stigma with that, isn't it?
Yeah.
And there's so much judgment. And when I was talking to my husband about this program tonight, and, I heard from Chalice Press how many books had sold. And I was like, isn't it great? All these books have sold. And he was just like, and, he's so supportive of this. And, it's vulnerable. And there's still that fear that we have about being judged. And as I wanted to open up to you all and have real talk tonight, I wanted to share also that I think in Christian circles around this idea of love and marriage, that somehow marriage will save us, that the love we experience in marriage will save us, or that my love will save my partner. And so that's just got to go. I mean, that is just nonsense that, especially if we're talking about serious clinical deep depression. I can love my husband to the moon and back. But he might need some medication. He might need therapy. I might need therapy in order for us to get better. And so that's just another kind of myth of perfect love that I wanted to bring up with you all.
Yeah. Because, even that idea of perfect love, is a misunderstanding and a mistranslation. Because the word perfect doesn't mean flawless. It means whole and complete. Like, love with your whole self. It doesn't mean do it flawlessly. Do it without failing. Do it without hurting. It's, you're whole. So that Christians have done us a disservice.
Yeah, that's where the shame for me comes in. It's like there's something wrong, or there's something I'm not doing right as a spouse, as a partner. If I loved more, then my partner would be happy. If my partner loved me more or better, then I would be happy. And so we end up like punishing ourselves or punishing our partner. And it's just like this endless cycle. And so for me, it was really helpful to frame the health of our marriage through mental health, and to say, look, there's all kinds of tools. There's all kinds of supports out there for us to strengthen our own self-love, right? Mm-hmm. And there's this idea in marriage theory about a love tank that, you know, we kind of expect other people to pour into our love tank and that we pour into the other love tank. But as you all know, some of the symptoms of mental health challenges can really make it difficult to have that extra to give. And so I wondered, either from your research or from your own lived experiences, how have you navigated that in your intimate partnerships or people you've worked with when there's nothing in the love tank? What do you all do? Or what do you recommend people can do?
I think in my case, it's interesting because I'll say it a couple ways. So I had a conversation with my wife. This goes back probably about a year and a half or so ago, and I was actually dealing with some concerns of my own, some challenges, and she expressed the fact that she had actually, in many ways, given of herself. I don't want to say sacrificed, but in some ways sacrificed some of herself to help me. And in other words, gave of herself in terms of just energy and just loving and not to say that I was always put in front of her needs, but I think what happened was I think she felt that she needed to take care of herself as well. And I think, of course, in these situations, I mean, the whole idea of self-care, but that's almost I don't want to say a trite way of putting it, but just being able to be reciprocal and to, it's a give and take in these things. I mean, for me, I've learned kind of the hard way of you know, giving as well as taking, but also, like you said, filling that tank when I need to. There's times when, frankly, I just shut down, and that it's sort of like a understood that, okay, this is my time just to recoup. And that, of course, we've been around each other long enough that she knows that's what's happening, and there's no alarm bells that are going off. But it's a challenge, and I recognize that it's a challenge for her sometimes to live with someone like me who can throw things into you know, a tailspin every once in a while.
When I have worked with couples in marriage counseling, and one of them talks about this being exhausted, I usually ask, you know, are you trying to do work that's not yours to do? You know, if you're empty, chances are you're trying to do something that's not yours to do. And I try to remember that for my own self when I get to that place where I feel exhausted. And quite honestly, it's not usually my spouse that drains me. So it's often other things. But still, it's when I'm trying to do emotional work that's not mine to do. Like, my love, no matter how deep it is not going to be enough to fix anyone.
Yeah, I think this really does bring in kind of this other myth, if you will, of marriage being something that fixes us, and marriage being a way to get our, you know, deepest needs met, the longings that we, you know, have not been able to fulfill elsewhere. We get married, and somehow our partner is supposed to be responsible for doing that for us. I think that's it's just a myth, and the sooner that kind of understanding of, you know, love is invitational, and it is a decision every day, right? So if we have a need, first and foremost, we do have to understand it as our need. I need, and those, you know, speaking in I language, and being responsible for that, and absolutely having our partner, having other people in our village and in our kind of support circle to ask for help when we need it is so important. But to kind of look to that one person and a partner to fill that love tank, and to kind of do so in a way that's an expectation, I think is where that disappointment and again, just kind of this, it's an impossibility to meet that every time. I love the give and take language that was being used, and just I think in many ways it feels like, you know, at any point in a marriage that especially if we're not looking longitudinally, somebody's going to be giving more, somebody's going to be taking more. It's not going to be 50-50. So there's this sense of, also really trusting that sometimes your partner is doing the best they can, and it may look like 30, but that's the best they have.
I really appreciate you talking about the village and how, we have to have our tank filled in more than one gas station, right? I guess if we're going
like
with that metaphor. I've thought about this probably even more so as being a parent and one who does, I guess, kind of attachment style parenting. Not that that was the intention, but that's kind of how it turned out. And I realized, you can't do anything if the tank is empty, right? If there haven't been enough cuddles, if there haven't been enough fun, which is, really easy to forget about in these times when it's hard to do the fun stuff that we're used to sometimes doing. And so I'm like, oh, wait, we're going to keep fussing and clashing and having all these issues if we don't just stop and play. And so sometimes, I think that works great for my kid. So I think it also works okay, stop everything. We're just going to play and fill the tank, a little bit more. It's not going to be full, but it'll be a little bit more. And if I don't have it, I'm gonna arrange a play date so that someone else can fill the tank. And that was my contribution to getting your tank fuller. And, thinking of that in the same way with ourselves. Well, okay, if this person doesn't have it, then let's arrange some play dates with other people so we can get the tank a little fuller. Because running on empty is something that, religious leaders are great at. And are running on negative resources, and it is not the way to go, and it is the opposite of what makes for good mental health.
I love that. I just have to say real quick, I love that because I know when I think about how my relations have been over time, the fact that my wife, whenever I say, so I'm in a 12-step program. And over time, I'll say, oh, I really need to go to a meeting. But she's never said, oh, what are you doing that for? Or whenever I say, oh, I want to exercise. I mean, just being very supportive. And likewise, over time, I realized that she needs her space to do her thing. And I need space to do my thing. And that's how we fill our tanks. There's this, Sarah and Rachel know me from Facebook. And I'm always giving musical references. And so there's this one lyric that says the space between us leaves room for us to grow. And I really love that because in relationships, there should be a space. We shouldn't be, like this. There should be, some wiggle room so we can each develop ourselves as human beings and still have some overlap, but still ultimately be able to become who God intends us to be.
So I talked to my wife, Lee, about this love tank concept earlier this evening. I was curious kind of how she would respond. And she shared with me something that I thought was really helpful, which is that she thinks of it less in terms of a tank that gets sort of filled and empty on any given day and more in terms of seasons, which I think is helpful, not just in terms of talking about marriage and mental health challenges, right? But it again, gets back at that sort of what are some of the foundational myths we bring with us into this conversation, right? If we think about our spirituality mainly in terms of something that just is either filling us or empty in any given day, if we think about marriage in terms of that, relationships in terms of that, rather than thinking in terms of our faith can go in seasons, right? Our relationships and our ability to support each other in different ways can go in seasons. In the, kind of traditional liturgical churches, right, we have penitential seasons, right? Where we kind of focus on some of the more somber themes of the life of faith, right? And then we have these seasons of kind of feasting. Admittedly, as someone with bipolar disorder, maybe I am attracted to this idea, right, of some extreme poles there, right? But right, if I think of a relationship as being about something that has to kind of fulfill me and fill me up, that's often going to be disappointing, right? But if I think of it in terms of accompaniment through seasons, then there's a sort of longer haul in it together sense in which I think we approach the conversation.
David, I think you're right. It's that false expectation that I think, Christina, you also pointed to. You know, what is it that we're expecting our spouses to do for us, and what do we expect to be able to do for our spouses? I think most of the time we get married with completely unrealistic expectations, you know, in terms of who's going to fill who up, and, you know, how's that going to be? You can be my one and only emotional support. You can do all these things for me, or I can do them for you. And it just doesn't work, and can become extraordinarily unhealthy if you persist on that road.
Yeah. Yeah. And we're up against, in particular with mental illness, up against some powerful cultural narratives, right? When Hollywood tackles mental illness, by the end of hour 2, right, usually like the love interest has healed the situation, right? Beautiful Mind and Silver Linings Playbook, right? I mean, you could pull all sorts of examples, which, you know, of course, like, that's not how that works, right?
Everything's solved in 2 hours.
Like, you know, Bradley Cooper. It's not necessarily like your model for healthy relationships. So, but, you know, those are powerful narratives, right? I mean, those shape our kind of cultural understandings of something like marriage and of something like mental illness in ways that it takes some work to push against, right? To deconstruct that.
Well, it wouldn't be real talk about real marriage without talking about sex. So this is my question. No, I'm just kidding. But there is that element, of physical intimacy and how different mental health.
That's a curveball, Sarah. That's a real curveball you throw at us there.
You all can talk about that in your own time and privacy, but that's a part of it, right? You know, how we relate to people spiritually, emotionally, physically. And a lot of chronic health conditions are ways that we live in our bodies and have different levels of energy, different levels of desire, and different seasons in our lives and in our marriage.
So are we actually talking about this, or are we not talking about it?
The floor is open.
I don't think we talk honestly and openly enough about how physical changes impact a relationship and mental health. I'm going to risk oversharing and say that when I went through menopause, my libido disappeared. And for the longest time, my wife was concerned that I was no longer interested in her. And that created a strange dynamic, because it wasn't so much lack of interest, I just wasn't feeling it. And without communicating about that, it could have gotten really weird, like really weird, and not very healthy. So, we don't talk. I know my mother never said anything about what menopause did in her body beyond migraines. And I'm guessing her mother before her said nothing. And so if we're not sharing this information, not only with other women, but with men who are in relationship with women about various changes the body can go through. I know postpartum depression is a real thing for a lot of women, and we're not talking about that either. I mean, these are things that are in some ways predictable, that have an impact on the relationship and therefore our mental health.
And to add on to that, of course, the other element is just medication itself. Mm-hmm. Certainly, if you're taking certain medications, it's going to affect you. And the partner, spouse, may not understand that either, nor actually the person may not, for that matter. Why is this happening? I know I belong to a Facebook group for people who live with bipolar disorder, and I'll tell you, it's a common thread that you'll see that comes up. People ask, how does it affect your sex life, or how does it affect your intimacy? And medications, that is. And I know for folks in some aspect it does. And that is a struggle, because it's almost like it's something that you feel like you have no control over. It's like you have to take your choice, right? Do you want the this, or do you want that? And it seems like it's always all or nothing. There's no middle ground, unfortunately, and that's where I think the struggle is sometimes.
Yeah, I remember saying to a psychiatrist early on, well, I look at the side effects of these medications here, and it says it's going to kill my sexual desire. I don't think that's going to help my depression, right? Like, that's going to make things worse. So what else you got, right? And I was like, is there any other class of drugs? Like, what? Flip the page. What you got? Samples, new drugs, right? I mean, because I was concerned about that. And it wasn't a matter like, am I having sex? Am I not having sex? I felt like I should want to have sex, right? I don't take the desire. And yet you're also like, but I can't sleep, but I can't function, right? And you feel like you're weighing these two things. And of course that would, affect relationships, and then throwing in hormones. And so you often, and I don't think we always classify it as mental health, but all, being a woman who's going to have hormonal changes with reproductive health, right? With, with monthly reproductive health issues, or again, with pregnancies or menopause or your larger life changes, hormones and mental health and medication are like this fireball in a way, right? That even very few doctors always put them all together when you're sitting here saying, and this is how I feel. And of course, women are the ones who have hormonal changes, right? But it can be really pronounced when you start working in those major changes.
For me, the experience of mental illness is I don't know like exactly the right language to put on this, but like it's a disembodied experience, or like a falsely disembodied experience, right? I feel like I'm kind of not in my body, right? When I'm in a really bad place with bipolar disorder. For folks like me who are prone to sort of self-harming ideation and behavior, right? One of the things that's going on there kind of behind the curtain is this like desire to feel something, right? To feel something, even if it's a negative thing, right? Even if it's pain, right? And that's hard to talk about. That's hard to communicate about. And the reason I want to say that is to say that like the church has often been pretty complicit, pretty willing to go along with the disembodiment of experience, right? The idea that like we can just sort of separate our brain and our spirit out from the experience we're having as an embodied person, which is part of what makes mental health stigma in the church so strong and so powerful, right? Because shouldn't we just be able to kind of think our way through this, right? Doesn't faith mean I should just be able to kind of overcome this thing going on mentally? So I think like just in general, right, we need to like bring the body back in to conversations, and that does mean being able to talk about intimacy, that does mean being able to talk about like our skin touching other skin, and I think that's a powerful antidote to some of the very things that have caused like the stigma around mental health challenges to begin with.
And I'll just echo this notion that mental health is very fluid. Mental illness is very fluid. That I think that over the course of one's lifetime, over the course of a year, over the course of some months, that can shift. And so when I think about premarital counseling that I've done, I think this conversation is really helping me to really hone into this notion of what just stages of life and hormonal changes, and yes, pregnancy and postpartum. I think that both those life events, I think there are correlations between what it means to have different levels, whatever your baseline was before, different levels of operating and functioning that impact libido, that impact, how we are embodied and experiencing our bodies. And I think that it's something that can certainly be talked about in ways that are that are before the marriage better. I'm speaking to myself as I say this, but typically premarital counseling is time limited. It's 6 sessions or so. So you don't always get into everything. And so it has to do with, what are we prioritizing, and how much are we saying that this matters, to kind of give people a roadmap to some degree, right? Every journey is different about what's normal, but they, the kind of some of the things that I think we don't talk about, but are still very much normative in terms of experiences.
I wanted to share from my book on page 128. It's towards the end, and I realized after thinking about and researching and writing the book that while we are not the first ones who are in blessed unions that have mental health challenges, we can be the last ones who keep these truths about our lives silent because of shame. And so thank you all for joining me for this real talk about real marriage. So I began to imagine, what would it look like to have marriage vows that named these realities? And so I offer a chance to renew your vows or think about your vows in this way. This is my promise to you. I will see you as a whole person and not as your worst symptom. I will love you for who I know you to be and not for how you feel or behave. This is my promise to me. I will see myself as a whole person and not as my worst symptom. I will love myself for who I am known to be, not for how I feel or behave. This is my promise to us. We will seek support from family and friends and wider circles of care, so we can faithfully live into these promises. We will bless our union each and every day, knowing God is love and trusting God is with us. And so I think those vows really help us honor what we are talking about, the seasons of our lives and the different ways that different life situations impact how we feel, how we behave, and ultimately know that we are more than our illness. We are more than our diagnosis, and that we can love ourselves and we can offer that authentic love for our partners.
Yeah, I think about when I got married, our vows were pretty basic. Not that they were the textbook, vows, but I think back, what you just shared, if it's just to go back in time and relive it as you're describing, I think in many ways would be perhaps more realistic, if you know what I mean. Because, and as was said at the beginning, I think oftentimes at the beginning of marriages, sometimes, people, and I'll reference myself, sometimes you have this belief that it's just going to be the greatest thing in the world. It's going to just be this, and I understand that it's not always like that, but I think there's just some preconceptions that need to be challenged. So the way that you're describing in your vows is a really more sensitive way of saying, love me for who I am as a whole person, not just part of who I am, not just the good stuff. You got to have all the stuff.
We have a lot of really good questions coming in, so I am going to break in and lift those up now, if that's okay. I also know that Monica Coleman needs to leave a little early, so if you see her disappear, that's okay. And we're so glad you were here with us. But here's our first question, which is pretty great one. Good evening, everyone. I'm wondering if you could speak to the impact and complication of toxic masculinity on stigma and silence. Anybody want to tackle that one?
Sure. Yes. Absolutely. If you are not allowed to ever admit that you're weak, then talking about mental illness becomes very difficult, right? If we teach boys and men that the primary approach you have to have to the world is one of defending yourself against any accusation of weakness, then the idea of seeking help, the idea of admitting vulnerability, right? The idea of saying, hey, I'm feeling this way, and I think what I need is this, is not only like a foreign concept, but actually a threatening concept, right? So yeah, 100%, we have to do better when it comes to the way we educate, the way we form gendered perceptions, and the results of it are deadly, right? Because when we look, for example, at suicidality, right, while more women in a given year will like participate in suicidal behaviors, more men will die as a result of suicidal behaviors. And so there's and that's just the self-inflicted harm, not to mention the harm that targets others, right, as a result of those same forces. So yeah, I mean, I'll stop there. I'm sure others have insights as well.
I heard that question entirely differently, which isn't a big surprise. We are very different people. I heard it like, what do you do if you're in relationship with someone who has bought into that toxic masculinity? Because I have been in those relationships. So you can't fix it. If that's any part of the question, is you alone can't fix it. And if that person isn't willing to address their issues in therapy, then the healthiest thing you can do is end the relationship. That's how I heard the question, but I don't know which way it was intended.
That's a really important, Rachel. I'm glad you said that.
Well, and I think it's also important to remember that it's that people of all genders can buy into toxic masculinity.
Absolutely.
So if the expectation is that the masculine in the man is always going to be strong and can't be weak, then, like that's what you need, right? Out of, the masculine that one's attracted to, then that's also a problem, because then it's not allowing that person to be vulnerable or to feel or express, that lack of perfection, not the perfection you talk about, Rachel, but the bad perfection, right?
Right.
That everyone needs in relationships. But that especially if you're living with a mental health challenge, and I mean, I'm like, it's a pandemic. Who doesn't have a mental health challenge right now? Right? Like this is all of us at the moment.
The world is a mental health challenge right now.
Yes, indeed.
Well, that could lead to this next question. How do you balance each other's needs if both partners have mental health issues? And Monica, as you said, we're all having mental health issues. An example is I've been diagnosed with anxiety and depression my whole life. During the pandemic, my partner was diagnosed with anxiety and mild depression. What do we do if we're experiencing symptoms at the same time? I want to be supportive, but I know if my mental illness flares up, I can be selfish, and I don't want to be. How can we be supportive of each other in the midst of our own crises? Great question.
That's why there's 9 people in my marriage. So we each have our individual therapists. We have a marriage therapist. We have a family therapist. We have a psychiatrist. We have a family practice doctor. And we have a babysitter that's with us when we can do that safely. So that's my hope, is that if they are both people in the partnership have mental health challenges, that you surround yourselves with support and talk to your friends about it, talk to your family about it.
What I like about the question, though, is that I think that there are people who have been diagnosed and have been living with a mental health challenge and have thought about it intentionally, right, for a while, encountering people who might be thinking about this for the first time in a pandemic, right, or experiencing something or being conscious of it for the first time since we've had this very intense situation that we're in now. And I think, I experienced this challenge as well, right? And so I think that does make it more difficult. And yet I love your answer about how much support you need. And it makes me think about David saying, I'm like, and what kind of health insurance do you have? Like, that was my first thought, was like, who is funding this, right? Like, because who doesn't need 9 people in your partnership? We all do. I mean, whether it's, right, like we all need like 2, like the first babysitter 1, babysitter 2, right? The long-term married couple you can call with your questions, the people, your girlfriend you can vent to, right? You know what I mean? Like, I feel like we all need these, like a team to keep our partnerships together. But the professionalization of it requires resources that everyone should have access to.
Right. And Monica, you bring up the good point, is that not everyone has access to the professional piece, but God willing, we all have access to the village. That maybe you can't afford to have all the therapists because your insurance won't cover them all. But do you have a good friend you can talk to? Do you have somebody who's outside of your house? Because I've referred to depression as the great deceiver. It tells us all kinds of lies about ourselves and about the partner we're in relationship with and what they think. And if you have somebody outside of you that when you're struggling with those symptoms, they can say, look, you've been here before, and every indication is that you will get through this, and your partner's along for the journey. And if it starts to feel like they're not, then talk to people, share that with the village that you have. Even during pandemic, we have access to a village, even if it's just a phone call or a text. I've had a lot of texting with folks who are going through crises, friends. These are not even my parishioners. Just saying, I don't know what to do with this. And it's like, just breathe. You will get through this. You're not alone. Sometimes it's that you're not alone reminder that makes the most difference. If you don't have access or you can't afford the co-pays for all the different therapists, there's at least got to be some solid friends or family members that you can say out loud, I'm feeling this, and they can do the reality check with you, which is really helpful.
Yeah, and I would also add that because of the pandemic, there have been more and more support groups that have gone virtual, so are accessible virtual across the country, across the world, whether that be NAMI support groups with others that are living with mental illness, or sober support groups, or other kind of topical organized groups that, again, like everyone else has said, so that you don't look to your partner to be to be everything to you when it comes to the support you need. And just as a practical tool that I have found really helpful, Mary Ellen Copeland has this, it's called the WRAP plan, Wellness Recovery Action Plan. And what I like about that is it just helps folks to identify the things that keep them well on a daily basis. But as it relates to this conversation, while you have the plan about what you're responsible for daily and kind of what to do if things are starting to get stressful or breaking down, what do you turn to? What I really like is it also is, how do others know that I need help and what should they do? So it helps partners, I think, know what to look out for, to even kind of know what their role is, because sometimes we want to help or we want to fix, and that's not really what the person needs, or that's not really what's, our interpretation of what's going on is not what's going on. So it gives that power to the individual to say, these are things that I need to look out for. These are things you can do if you see them. Here are people that can be involved in my care as kind of an advance directive, right? This is where and who I want to, help connecting me with. And so I think it may take down some of the anxiety about how do we care for one another in those kind of partnerships.
Thank you for lifting up WRAP, Wellness Recovery Action Plan. That's in my book, and I suggest it for blessed unions, for partnerships that we have those. And I know we're working on our plan. We have just a few more minutes for our real talk about real marriage. So thank you all for coming out tonight. This has been just really, really important conversation. And I'd like to invite each of you to share a few words of encouragement, hope. If there are other resources you want folks to know about, welcome you to share those as we wrap up.
Yeah, I think as Rachel and others have said, right, you're not alone is basic and the most powerful thing to be said, right? You're not alone. There are other people. Your village is bigger than you think, right? And so I think just in having conversations like this is a topic where just the act of having a conversation about it is already creating the kind of change that we hope to see, because it's creating the space and the opportunity for people to be able to share more honestly about something. And that has a tremendous impact. So yeah, you're not alone.
I would, so a resource, and I know you mentioned in your book, Sarah, and I'm sure others here know it as well in the panel, but Mental Health First Aid is a great program that teaches individuals pretty much what you would need to know about how to understand mental health from a, I guess I would call it a layperson perspective, but it just gives a lot of valuable tools and how you can help someone who might be in a crisis or non-crisis situation. So mentalhealthfirstaid.org is the website. And I guess my words of encouragement and hope go along the lines of what I believe for a long time, and then many people use the same slogan, but recovery is possible. And while I believe, and I'm sure we all here believe that recovery is possible, a blessed union is possible too, through applying, the tools that you can learn. Sometimes just going through this journey together with each other, with your partner, and being open and being open-minded and being willing to change. Of course, that was a big one for me, being willing to change, and then being willing to understand that it's not always about me, even though I might be the person primarily with the challenge. We have to remember that we have to take our loved ones into account.
I'm kind of with David. My first thought was you're not alone. Whatever you're experiencing in your primary relationship, other people have experienced it before you. And if you're able to work it through with your partner and end up in a truly blessed union, that's great. And if you're not, you will heal from that too. And no doubt, if you get the support you need, recovery and wellness is possible even after a union breaks. There is hope, and you're not alone. I often say to myself, many people have been in this situation before me, and many people will be in the situation after me unless I open my mouth and talk about it.
I will just echo what's been said. I just affirm that as the human race, we are all vulnerable to mental illness at any given point in time. It is a part of the human condition. And if ever one is feeling in that space of vulnerability, to know that you can reach out and that you do not have to go it alone. And if you ever notice someone who's in that space of vulnerability, that these are ways that there are ways that you can help and connect them with help. And for those who are partnered and navigating these waters as partners, you're not alone. And so I'm really grateful for the work, Sarah, that you're doing to tell the story and to continue talking about what that is like, so that people really do hear that this is possible and that there is hope.
So my new favorite resource is this new book by Sarah Lund called Blessed Union. I highly recommend we all grab it and see how she and other couples have done this, so that we're not out here trying. You don't have to reinvent the wheel, and you can see what's there. So that's my resource to share.
In the Frontier Revival, that's the exhorter. You come like after the preacher. And
Well, you all were so gracious in endorsing the book, and we were so grateful for you doing so. And Sarah, I don't know if you wanted to have a final word here, but I would just say thank you all so much for being in this conversation. There were a couple questions we didn't get to, and I'm sorry, because they're real talk about real marriage. So I hope you'll continue to ask the questions and find other people to be in conversation with. But Sarah, I'll give you the last word here, just to say also, Blessed Union, available now wherever you buy books. And if you love it, go leave a review somewhere and maybe post about it on your social media page. We'd really appreciate it.
Thank you all for this real connection. And my hope and prayer is that we stay connected and we keep the conversation going. So big blessed love to you all. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to end the